In the summer of 1991, India was facing its worst economic crisis since independence. The country was essentially running on fumes. Our foreign exchange reserves had dipped so low that they could barely cover 3 weeks of essential imports. If you were living in India then, you might remember the uncertainty, the fear that the country would default on its international debt. It was a moment of reckoning that forced India to change how it did business with the world. To understand the crisis, we have to look at the system that came before it, the license Raj. For decades, if you wanted to start a business, expand a factory, or even import raw materials, you needed government permission for everything. This thick layer of red tape meant that companies spent more time in government offices than innovating. Productivity was low, and the Indian market remained isolated from global competition. The catalyst for the collapse was the Gulf War in 1990. As oil prices spiked, India's import bill skyrocketed. Simultaneously, remittances from Indians working in the Middle East dried up. The balance of payments crisis was imminent. India was spending more dollars than it was earning, and international lenders were losing confidence in our ability to pay them back. The country was staring at a total bankruptcy. The government took an unprecedented and painful step to avoid default. It shipped 47 tons of gold from the Reserve Bank of India to the Bank of England as collateral for a loan. Seeing the country's gold reserves being moved out was a national shock. It was a clear signal that the old way of doing things had failed, and radical reform was the only path forward. In June 1991, P.V. Narasimha Rao became Prime Minister and appointed Dr. Manmohan Singh as his Finance Minister. Singh, a former RBI governor and economist, realized that tinkering around the edges wouldn't work. The government needed to dismantle the license Raj entirely. In his historic budget speech, he famously quoted Victor Hugo, "No power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come." The reforms were immediate and sweeping. The first major move was devaluation of the rupee. By lowering the value of the currency, the government hoped to make Indian exports more attractive and competitive globally. While it made imported goods more expensive for the average citizen, it was the necessary medicine to stop the outflow of capital and revive the trade balance. Next, the government scrapped industrial licensing for almost all sectors. Suddenly, companies didn't need to beg for government permits to set up factories or launch new products. This unleashed the power of the private sector. It was no longer about who you knew in the bureaucracy, it was about how efficient and innovative your company could be in a competitive market. Liberalization wasn't just about Indian companies, it was about inviting the world in. The government opened sectors like telecommunications, banking, and aviation to foreign direct investment. Global brands started entering the Indian market, bringing not just capital, but new technology and management practices. For the first time, Indian consumers had access to choices that were previously unavailable. The trade policy also underwent a massive overhaul. High tariffs, which were meant to protect local industry but ultimately made them stagnant, were slashed. The goal was to integrate India with the global supply chain. This forced Indian companies to improve their quality standards. If they wanted to survive, they couldn't just rely on lack of competition, they had to compete on a global stage. The financial sector, specifically banking, was also reformed. Private banks were allowed to operate, and interest rates were deregulated. This created a more robust system for credit and investment. Money could finally flow where it was most productive, rather than being directed by government mandates that ignored market realities. By the mid-90s, the results were visible. Inflation began to stabilize, and foreign exchange reserves started to climb back to healthy levels. The GDP growth rate, which had been stagnant for decades, began to accelerate. The Hindu rate of growth was a thing of the past, and India began its journey toward becoming one of the fastest-growing major economies in the world. However, these reforms were not without their critics. Some argued that the focus on growth left behind certain social sectors and that the transition was too harsh on those who were protected by the old system. But the data suggests that the move prevented a catastrophic economic collapse and paved the way for millions to be lifted out of poverty through new jobs and opportunities. The 1991 reforms serve as a vital lesson in economic history. It proves that isolationism might feel safe in the short term, but it often leads to systemic stagnation. When a country adapts, welcomes competition, and clears the path for private enterprise, it creates a multiplier effect that benefits the entire economy. It shows that openness, while challenging, is often the only route to long-term prosperity.